Aloha and good morning, and thank you for joining us for the 2023 Hawaii Counseling and Advising Convening. We would like to remind everyone that today's presentation is being recorded and will be posted on the event website. Please keep all cameras off and all microphones muted throughout the session. We would like to thank our live captioners who will be providing closed captioning for accessibility purposes. Since it is live, captions may not accurately reflect what is being said. However, captions will be corrected for session recordings, and recordings and resources will be posted to our website between 3 and 4 weeks after today's presentation. If you have any questions throughout the presentation today, please add them into the chat box, and I will do my best to get those questions to our presenter. And without taking up any more time, I would like to introduce Julia Freeland Fisher from the Clayton Christensen Institute. And she is the author of the book, Who You Know, Unlocking Innovations That Expand Students' Networks. And I will turn it over to Julia.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan. Great to be here. Good morning, or in my case, out in DC, good afternoon. Really excited to be here today to talk to you about some of the innovations that I've been looking at that really allow career services professionals to think broadly about the opportunities to expand students' networks. So I'll be walking through a slide deck presentation. Ryan, is it? Okay, there we go. So I'll be walking through some of the data we know about why social capital matters immensely to students' career prospects and long-term career success. Then I'll be diving into an array of examples that we're observing nationally, some very large-scale cross-campus efforts, some single professors that have really sought to tackle what they see as network gaps that their students are facing. And lastly, some of the work that nonprofits that partner with institutions of higher ed are doing to supplement students' access to social capital. So I want to start off with a couple questions you can answer in the chat. Wondering if folks have a guess as to the average staff to student ratio in career services nationwide. Just throw out a number in the chat if you're listening. I'll wait a few seconds and then do a big reveal. I don't have a prize for whoever gets it right. Any guesses? $600 from Katrina, $500 from Dana. And this may be not representative at your institutions, right? But this is the national average, gives you a sense of sort of what higher ed institutions are grappling with today. So the number I think is pretty staggering. This comes from NACE, that on average, colleges have one staff member for every over 2,000 students. And what that tells us, I mean, like many things in higher ed, that institutions are capacity constrained, that they have a lot of challenges in terms of reaching and serving all students at scale. But it also tells us that that one staff member cannot be the core source of social capital and networks that students are relying on. We have to get creative to get beyond that. Another little test for the audience. What percent of college graduates, again, national average, do you think report that their alumni network was helpful in the job market? Meaning, I went out and looked for a job either before graduating or after graduation, and I was able to tap into and leverage my alumni network. What percent of college graduates think that that network is helpful? Again, just a guess would be great. 80%, 10%, 25%. Okay, you guys are sort of all over the map, but Katrina gets the closest. Average of 9%, right? So this is students saying that despite the fact that we put on glossy pamphlets advertising all the benefits of alumni networks, in fact, our alumni networks to date in higher ed tend to be quite undercapitalized. They are not necessarily being leveraged to the extent that I think the kind of mythology in higher ed would suggest. So those two statistics to me start to unearth kind of the hidden challenges that students are grappling with when it comes to having access to the networks they may need to get the jobs they want. And I often in my work, oh, and Dana, that's okay, just network, I totally get it. But often in my work, I use a very simplistic diagram to help us think about this idea of social capital. So oftentimes in education, and I'd argue even in the career pathways conversation, we index heavily on what students know, what they can do, whether they have the skills for that entry level job, whether they've attained the credential to break into the industry they're looking to break into. And despite the fact that that what is critically important, we can all recognize that as ourselves, employees who have invested time and blood and sweat and tears into what we know. The reality, if you look at the data, is that opportunity sits at the cross section of what students know and who students know, in addition to who knows what students know, who has had the opportunity either through internships or other means to bear witness to students' potential and potentially make a bet on them when they hire them. What the data tells us is that an estimated half of jobs and internships, this is based on the most recent National College Internship Study, which found 53% of internships come through family and professor networks, but about half of jobs are coming through personal connections. And so if we talk about career services and don't talk about the importance of networks, we are underselling students on what it takes to break into the labor market today. This idea of social capital gets talked about a lot in the research. There's many competing definitions, but for the purposes today, and as you're thinking about a sort of new approach to career services that acknowledges the importance of social capital, it's really this basic idea that our networks contain value. It's also the idea that our students have the ability not just to know the right people, but to mobilize those relationships in service of their goals. They actually have the confidence, awareness, and skills to tap into networks to advance their career prospects. In addition, something to think about is getting really crisp on what sorts of resources students may be needing to access through networks. Obviously, maybe in the ideal world, the resource you're accessing is someone who's willing to hire you. That's a very literal way of thinking about this. But there's a whole bunch of other resources that we know, and you guys as career services professionals know, go into the job seeking process, right? It can be everything from emotional and appraisal support, having people who believe in you. It can be information about a given industry that you actually need to know to perform well in an interview. It can be advice on how to navigate particular job application processes. And it can be referrals and references, even if that person can't hire you. And so having a vision of what not only are the networks we want our students to have, but what resources are we hoping are flowing through those networks can start to help you think expansively about the kinds of experiences your students might need. It's also important to understand from the research that not all relationships offer the same value. And this, I think, we can get really stuck in when we talk about career services, and particularly what I'm seeing in higher ed when there's a sort of emphasis put on mentorship. And I am the first person to say that mentorship is amazing, it's wonderful, it's beautiful. It is not the only route to opportunity, however. So what we see in the sociology research is that, in fact, there's different kinds of ties in our lives that tend to offer very different kinds of benefits. We have a few, our brains can handle sort of 4 to 6 of what sociologists call strong ties. These are the people with whom we maintain high levels of trust, reciprocity, and who we spend a lot of time with. There's a good news, bad news story here, though, which is that our brains, and this goes for your students as well, even if they're constantly on social media and appear to be hyper connected to the world, our brains can only handle so many strong ties because they tend to take up a fair amount of our bandwidth. So my lovely husband, who's doing daycare pickup and taking care of my little ones right now as I talk to you guys, he lends me all sorts of care and resources. He also, though, happens to be a very high bandwidth relationship in my life. I have to spend a lot of energy in order to gain those benefits and resources from him, right? The good news, though, is that our brains can handle many more of what sociologists call weak ties. And weak ties are, weak ties are our acquaintances, are the people that we may spend slightly less time with, have lower levels of trust with, but they actually tend to be the people that can offer us new information, new opportunities. In theory, right, alumni networks are an abundant source of weak ties. They may not be people that we know well, but they are definitely people who could, in theory, offer students information and opportunities. And the reality is that in job seeking, and I'll get to some of this research in a second, but in job seeking, both of these types of ties matter, but weak ties are actually more likely to be the route to new jobs. And so as we think about what does it mean to network students or to prepare them for careers, if you just give them a mentor and don't give them a weak tie network, you are shortchanging them on one of the ingredients we know leads to jobs. That research on the importance of weak ties was initially conducted by a researcher named Mark Granifetter back in the 70s, who went out and asked a number of of professionals how they had found their jobs, thinking he was going to hear from them, oh, someone I knew well opened this door for me or told me about this job. And in fact, people were sharing that it was mere acquaintances that had either provided information or referrals or access to their current job. So that's really the strength of weak ties. So what I want to posit as I dive into the research that we've been doing and some of the programs that might offer inspiration to you guys is that we need to stop framing career services as just giving students the information that they need to get jobs. But really, we have to tackle connection gaps. We have to ensure that students have both the strong ties and diverse weak tie networks they need to have options in the job market post-graduation. So, what does the research tell us about this? What the research really tells us right now is that this is a major equity issue. And I know that career services is a challenging field because of some of those capacity constraints that we talked about at the beginning in serving all students. But this is a particularly acute challenge, making sure that students have the networks they need to get the jobs they want when it comes to students who are either first in their family to go to college or may come from low income households. So, what we know is that students are inheriting unequal networks into the knowledge economy. So students whose parents have a bachelor's degree or more, again, whose parents went to college, are twice as likely to know lawyers, CEOs, professors, congresspeople. Whether you want to know a congressperson in 2023 is a different discussion. But this means that students, before they even step foot on your campus, have inherited vastly different professional networks vis-a-vis their parents and their parental education level. The other thing that we know, and this is from research on adolescence, is that youth from the top SES quartile are far more likely to report access to non-family member adults in their lives. And this is largely because of extracurricular spending gaps. If your parents are shelling out and buying you all sorts of extracurricular or co-curricular experiences, even before college, not to mention during college, those experiences are network expanding. And unfortunately, young people from the bottom socioeconomic quartile are much less likely to enjoy those experiences. And therefore, despite the fact that they report equal kinship networks, who might have all sorts of resources, but might not be equally networked into the knowledge economy, they are also not accessing other adults who could help them navigate the job market long term. We also know, and I apologize if this is such a mainland centric slide here. I'll give you guys the link when I wrap up to look up Hawaii zone data. But we also know that cross-class connections are a leading predictor of upward mobility. This is research from Raj Chetty and his colleagues at Opportunity Insights, where the researchers looked at millions and millions and millions of Facebook connections over decades and wanted to understand what predicts whether people rise out of poverty. And the leading predictor was whether people growing up in low income households had access to higher income individuals. And what you see here is that there's a geography of that sort of access. In some communities, you're much more likely, if you're growing up in a low income household, to know people in higher income brackets. The good news, I looked up Hawaii's data right before this, is that you guys actually show up as like blue, light blue on this map. You actually have fairly high rates of socioeconomic integration. The thing to keep an eye on as a career services professional, though, is that those are averages. And the question you want to ask is, are the students I'm serving, particularly those from low income households, gaining access to higher income individuals in the course of their career search, such that they have access to new opportunities that might otherwise be out of reach and allow them access to upwardly mobile jobs? Other data, this is from Strata, has shown us that college students themselves are actually talking about the importance of networking and how they actually feel the least confident relative to other kind of career seeking skills in their ability to network. So if we go back to that 9% of graduates say their alumni network was helpful, we can diagnose a variety of reasons that might be the case, but I'd argue one of them is on this slide, right? That students simply aren't building the confidence during their college years to actually tap into and mobilize networks. We also know that equity gaps show up in this Strata survey. So Strata looked at participation in a variety of social capital building activities, all of which showed major benefits across career clarity, around whether you've gotten supportive feedback on where you're headed, whether you have experience that has helped you clarify career plans. Social capital building while on campus informs all of those. And at the same time, first gen students are far less likely than their continuing generation peers to have reported engaging in those experiences. So this may all be very intuitive to those of you who are working with students day in, day out, but I really want to underscore that when we talk about social capital, it's a critical asset for all students to get jobs, but it's a critical asset if you're keeping an eye on equity, that you need to be particularly mindful of whether your first generation students are accessing social capital at the same rate as their continuing generation peers. The last thing I want to highlight here is a recent study by LinkedIn that actually confirmed sort of the causal mechanisms behind that idea of the strength of weak ties. So they really tested what that researcher back in the 70s had found, this idea that you're more likely to find jobs through your weak tie network. That was indeed the case. What was most useful for job seekers on this large scale study that LinkedIn did was their moderately weak ties. And a moderately weak tie is not a total stranger. It's someone with whom you share 5 to 10 connections, right? It's someone with whom there's a little bit of commonality or common connections. Again, thinking about alumni networks as weak tie networks, I think, is a really critical sort of lens to bring to this. But LinkedIn's data really suggested that that is, in fact, the route to higher job transition or individuals securing new jobs. The other important finding in this study, however, is that strong ties, mentors, close confidants, close friends, parents, etc., are actually really critical buffers when we get rejected from jobs. So we don't want to say, okay, for the purposes of careers, you only need weak tie networks, strong ties don't matter. Because we know, particularly when students are trying to break into entry level jobs, that they are most likely going to encounter rejection. And we want to have sort of secure attachments in place for them to handle that. Okay, so that's why networks matter, in case anyone doubted that, which I highly doubt given that we're talking about career services. But it gives you a little bit of the texture behind why networks matter, how they matter, and how you might think about what sorts of connections you want to be putting within reach for students. Now the question is, given all of the constraints and challenges that campuses face today, how might career services approach proactively building their student social capital in more holistic, data-driven, effective, and equitable ways? And I want to give first a model that's a really full stack example, an expensive, elaborate, university integrated model of tackling these challenges. Knowing that that may not be realistic for the campuses where you all work, I then want to give a much smaller scale, modest example, but equally encouraging in terms of the types of activities that a professor is building out to ensure his students have access to social capital. And lastly, I'll talk about what we're seeing in the nonprofit space. So the first example I want to talk about is an effort called Life Design afoot at Johns Hopkins University. This is being led by an individual named Farouk Day. When Hawaii P20 approached me about doing this talk, I was like, I should not give this talk. Farouk Day should give this talk. But here I am as a humble surrogate in his place. If you have 10 minutes to spare, you should Google Farouk Day and Johns Hopkins and Life Design. I'm going to put his name in the chat and watch his TED Talk. Maybe not while I'm presenting, but feel free if you want to see not the poor man's version. This idea of life design, though, gets at what I think Day honed in on, which is twofold. That when we're talking about students choosing careers, it's not just about getting a job. It's about designing a life around that job. It's about figuring out what are your passions, what is your purpose, what are your curiosities, what are you most engaged in, and then figuring out how to align a career behind that vision. And speaking of equity and sort of the idea that certain students may have built-in privileges and advantages based on the networks and resources that they inherit, this is really an issue of equity. Affluent students for a long time have been designing their lives. The question is, can career services and universities at large take an approach that actually affords everyone access to the sort of luxury of life design? At its core, this is sort of the formula that Day talks about building at Johns Hopkins. It's the idea of scaling immersive experiences, which are everything from internships to co-ops to study abroad to research experiences, and pairing every student with mentors so that students are constantly throughout their 4 or 5 or 6 years on campus exploring their curiosities and taking risks. And he really underscores the importance of throughout their college career, the importance of risk taking so that you are actually exploring things that you might otherwise deem too high cost to explore post college. Now, what's interesting about what's happening at Johns Hopkins is that Farouk Day has the full support of the college president behind him. And as I've looked across the space at where the most sort of bold, full stack, immersive, to use his word, experiments in career services are happening, it's when the president is actually prioritizing this work, when a vice president is actually charged with this work in a really explicit way, which means that both resources and mind share of the university are being directed there. So I want to just be realistic that pulling something off that is really anchored on this idea of immersive experiences, I think hinges on sort of the blessing of the president and the board, and it's not something that a small career services office may be able to pull off at scale. I want to also talk about this idea of mentors, because I think that, as I alluded to a few slides ago, oftentimes career services and other advising programs, with the best of intentions, say our students need more support, we're going to create a mentoring program. And there can be a very general sort of goal there of this mentor is going to help the student make better decisions, navigate the university, think about how to apply to a job. What Johns Hopkins has started to isolate in their mentoring program is the idea that mentors should be there to serve a couple of functions. First, to de-risk what could feel risky to students, to provide sort of the support that a young person might need when they're saying, oh, I don't know if I should try this thing, I don't know if it will work out, right? And someone who can coach them through this idea of this is the right time while in college to take risks and explore your passions. So that role is a very specific role that they're hoping mentors will play. The other is explicitly thinking about mentors as brokers. So again, oftentimes in more general one-to-one mentoring programs, we think of the mentor as the relationship of interest. What Farouk Day has talked about is that mentors are there to be brokers to other networks. So they are not the sole relationship at play. They are actually explicitly being charged with introducing students to others in their network and coaching students on how to mobilize their networks. So I think that's a really important distinction. The last piece of this is that mentors are there to sort of help students, again, sort of lure this idea of what are students' curiosities out of them. So I love this quote from Farouk Day because it gets, again, at a very specific function that mentors can play of helping to say to students, what are you curious about? What are you passionate about, etc. So if you're currently running a mentoring program, I'd encourage you to look at what JHU is doing and think about, could our mentors play this role in addition to whatever role you're having them play, with an eye towards helping to de-risk exploration before students graduate so that they're actually not eating the opportunity cost of exploration post-graduation. The other thing I've just put here, this is a really confusing slide, you don't have to read all the words, is sort of the org chart or university model that is behind this work that I think makes it a much more full stack, comprehensive, and effective model, which is that what they've done at Johns Hopkins is centralize about 15 different offices that all serve different immersive learning functions into a single integrative learning and life design function. And you guys, I'm sure, have all been through various sort of chapters of departmental consolidation or modularizing departments on your campuses or various institutions. But this idea of integrating career services with other offices at the university, to me, is part of the reason why they've gotten such great results. So what Johns Hopkins has seen over the past 5-6 years of implementing this approach, student satisfaction with career services has nearly doubled, gone from about 37% to 68%. They've also closed gaps in career outcomes between their continuing generation and first generation students, and are on the way to closing gaps between their low income students and more affluent students. So they've seen huge ROI from this more integrated approach. again, I want to be realistic about the fact that this is a university-wide initiative, and you guys may not be in a place where that's a realistic approach to take, although I would encourage you to tell your presidents and provosts to look at that model for inspiration, or to reach out to Farouk directly again to get it from the horse's mouth. But I want to talk about a totally different example that's a much leaner, more modular, I'd argue much more scalable approach to these social capital gaps that universities need to tackle when they think about improving career services. This is an initiative out of Cal State Fullerton, which is one of the Cal State schools in Southern California. And Cal State Fullerton serves a much more diverse student population than does Johns Hopkins, many more commuter students, many more transfer students from community colleges. So a different set of challenges and opportunities on this campus. And I got to know a professor there named David Obstfeld when I heard about this concept, the Social Capital Academy, because all I think about all day is social capital. So I was intrigued, even just hearing about the name. But Professor Obstfeld is a professor at the business school at Cal State Fullerton. And what he observed is while teaching his capstone course, which is for graduating seniors who are about to secure their degrees and head out into the world of work, is that there were many students, a significant number of students in his classes, who hadn't had a single conversation with someone working in the industry that they wanted to break into. So they had been taking all their courses, doing everything that society tells them to do, and yet didn't have a vibrant view of a future in the industry that they espoused that they were interested in, because they didn't know anyone in that industry, right? So he was sort of frustrated by this, worried by this, saw that sort of the limited resources being put into career services at Cal State Fullerton were not necessarily going to fill this gap. And so he built something called Social Capital Academy. I'm just going to walk you through the model to understand why I think it's a more modest sort of inspirational model. So Social Capital Academy occurs over 4 Saturdays. He realized that Saturday mornings were the time, or midday was the time that most students' work schedules would allow them to attend an optional session. The first module, students are coached by mentors that Professor Obstfeld has recruited from industry to think about how to tell their story. And this is something you guys may be doing already in your work, but thinking about how to scale this, I think is a separate challenge, which is helping students who are particularly those who may have faced obstacles, who may have grown up not with the advantages of well-networked or well-resourced peers, to talk about their skills and resilience in a way that is persuasive to prospective employers. From there, module 2, which is a few weeks later on a different Saturday for a couple of hours, students start to meet career experts. They begin to build their professional network. They begin to meet with a coach who's going to stick with them for the remaining sessions, who actually, has been part of the first session, but is still with them in the second session. And they begin to talk about sort of the art of networking, making this idea that networks are part of the opportunity equation very explicit. In the third module, they actually practice with a new array of, again, weak ties, people they're meeting for the first time, practice social capital building. And in the fourth module, they sort of set some goals around where they want to head in terms of internship and job search. The volunteers that Professor Obstfeld has recruited remain sort of a pool of individuals that these students can tap back into. Now, interestingly, if I were a career services office, first of all, you can explore partnering with Social Capital Academy. They've now operated as a separate nonprofit and are starting to work with other campuses. But also think about how you might build something like this, a fairly light touch, light wireframe experience, and recruit alumni to play the role of these career experts and coaches. And again, this is a much lighter touch than what Johns Hopkins is building, but it's really going after that particular gap that Professor Obstfeld observed, which is some of your students may have career interests that have been in their head and in their classrooms for the past few years, but have not been part of conversations that they're having out in the world with real people working in those industries. So how can you set about scaling those conversations in a kind of organized way, and also scaling students' confidence to talk about themselves and their own story to prospective employers? So again, a much lighter touch model that we've seen. Now I want to talk about whether you were persuaded by integrated life design or something lighter touch like Social Capital Academy. I want to talk about what some of the sort of high performing nonprofits that we've been tracking in this space of building student social capital are doing to sustain their approach and make it more data driven. Because I think all of this sounds good on paper, but sustainability and data are often sort of challenges when you're trying to change or improve or add new functionality to whatever you're offering to students. So the first is a model called Co-op Careers. This is founded in New York and San Francisco, and now is operating, I want to say, in 6 or 7 cities nationwide. But Co-op works with recent college graduates who have successfully graduated but have not secured upwardly mobile jobs. All of the graduates they work with are first gen, mostly from low-income families. Most are living in places like San Francisco, making an average of $22,000 a year, working part-time jobs, and have been unable to convert their degrees into higher wage, better opportunities in the job market. Now, Co-op came in with the thesis that social capital was going to be critical for 2 reasons. First, they were very sort of attuned to the fact that job searching can be very isolating, particularly for recent grads who have not yet secured employment. So some of you as career services offices may be offering services for sort of 6 months to a year after graduation. You then know that there's a climate, I think, of despair and isolation that can set in if someone has successfully secured a degree but been unable to secure a job. So Co-op was very attuned to that. We have to tackle the isolation of job searching at the same time as actually helping people search for jobs and getting to that, getting to an offer. The second thing they were attuned to, though, was how difficult it is to scale human capital, social capital, excuse me, because it is so human capital intensive. Because, as you guys know, whether you've tried to recruit alumni volunteers to come back to campus or tried to create other mentoring programs, it's incredibly onerous to scale. So what they have done is really lean into near-peer alumni networks. Now, some of you may be familiar with the research in the space that near peers are particularly credible messengers when it comes to job searching. They have recent information. They're more relatable for students than someone who's a seasoned professional 10, 15, 20 years out in their career. Co-op was aware of that, but they were also aware that if they wanted to grow, they needed part-time coaches and they needed to be able to rely on their alumni to play that role. So Co-op story is really telling in terms of a scale story. They have scaled over the past, I want to say 7 or 8 years, 30 to 50% year over year by recruiting 1 in every 10 alumni to come back and serve as a part-time coach to their current participants. It's a stipended role, so it's not free for Co-op, but it's much more affordable than hiring full-time staff. And if you look at this, most of the people besides the social worker and some of the headquarters staff here are alumni that are powering the model. I think that that's an answer to how to move that 9% statistic that we talked about at the beginning, but it's also an answer of how to build community and combat the sort of isolation of job searching. The other thing that Co-op has found is that putting students into cohorts, which we often do in higher ed for purely efficiency reasons, is actually a really powerful tool when helping students search for jobs. So a cohort of similarly situated peers who are all looking for jobs at the same time can actually foster a sense of belonging, and from there can start to share job intel with one another. So whatever you're thinking about in terms of sort of modernizing your approach to building students networks, don't sort of forget about the fact that peer networks can be really powerful in the job search process. Now, here's the thing that I think is most fascinating coming out of this model, and it's a quote. I should have put who this is from. This is a quote from Kalani Leffer, the founder of Co-op, which is when they put students into these cohorts, they had a model. It's not showing up here. If you look here, they have a model where there's a cohort of 16 participants or students working with 4 near peer captains, right? So ostensibly that's a 4-to-1 ratio, way better than 1 to 2,262 or whatever the average I put up there at the beginning was around career services professionals. But what co-op has found is that they actually wouldn't want to go from 4 to 16 down to 1 to 4 ratios, right? If you're setting up a group coaching or mentoring model. Because what they found is there's not enough redundancy to create community, resilient networks, and frankly, less flaky networks. So if every if every 16 students has 4 coaches to turn to at a given time, they actually get a higher success rate than if every 4 students had 1 coach to turn to at a given time. That to me, sorry guys, I'm just gonna like speak off the cuff here, blows my mind when I think about the fact that the advising space and career services space has so long romanticized one-to-one advising as the pinnacle of quality. And what this program, which by the way is getting phenomenal results in terms of 75% of its participants securing jobs making 50K or more within 6 months, what they're finding is that you actually want many to many cohorts and coaches to actually unlock more social capital for your students and participants. So it's a really powerful model. It's a way in which I think what co-op would like to see long term, they're obviously sort of a separate nonprofit, but is really a commitment to this idea of alumni powered career services. How might near peer recent alums come back as part-time coaches to current students navigating the job market, which by the way is more complex than more seasoned professionals when they had to go out and get their jobs 10, 20 years ago was. So that's, I think, a really exciting example to look to for sort of a model design that's breaking through some of the scale limitations that colleges and nonprofits as well inevitably face. Okay, lastly, I want to talk about how career services models, a particular nonprofit called BASTA, is really unearthing social capital related data among its participants in order to guide its programming. So BASTA is a nonprofit out in New York City that's combating underemployment among first-gen college graduates of color. And they have been working really hard on a career diagnostic. I'm sure all of you have career diagnostics in place, so this is not a new concept, but they've been really working hard on designing a diagnostic that doesn't just assess sort of students' career aspirations, interests, and competencies, but their access to social capital, their exposure to networks, their exposure to careers vis-a-vis networks, and whether they know the people they may need to know in order to get the jobs they want. And I'll put in the chat when I stop screen sharing the site where they've collected and analyzed this data. But they're really finding that exposure to various careers through networks is a huge predictor of students securing first round interviews. So what you can see here is that students who report higher levels of exposure are 90% more likely to secure first round interviews. This gets back to the same problem that Professor David Obstfeld was solving for, right? This gets to the same thing that Farouk Day was solving for through immersive experiences, which is that if you're not increasing exposure, which is inherently, if you're not building student social capital where they are meeting people out in the world of work at a regular cadence, you are lessening the likelihood that they are securing, in this case, first round interviews that can convert to jobs down the line. One thing that's really interesting, there's a bunch of data in what they've mined that again, I can share the site so you can dig into it yourselves. But one of the things that I think they're seeing that's really telling is that there is a correlation between GPA and exposure. So your students that may actually require the most support given low GPA are also least likely to have exposure to any industries, right? Again, this is some of what David Obstfeld was worried about in his capstone course. What's interesting here, though, what you can't see highlighted is if you look down to GPA 3.5 plus, you still have over 30% of students who are apparently high flyers on paper reporting exposure to 0 industries that they're interested in, meaning they don't know people working in those industries. They haven't been able to explore them. So again, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I think this starts to give data to inform where do we need to target our social capital building efforts in order to create the greatest opportunity for students furthest from opportunity or to create the greatest ROI for all students. I want to end in the last few minutes here, and then we'll open up for Q&A, and maybe wrap early so you guys can get your day started and watch that TED Talk from Farouk Day. But I want to end with a bit of a provocation. I was actually sharing this with Ryan from Hawaii P20 before we hopped on this call. Ryan is participating with a number of high schools and nonprofits in Hawaii in some social capital building, design, and measurement work. And this is work that we're supporting nationally. And this is what I'm about to show you is a chart based on high school student responses. So I want to contextualize this and be very candid. This is not out of any higher ed institution. But I think it's really telling when we talk about students' networks and we try and create more experiences in JHU's in Johns Hopkins context, or more modules in Social Capital Academy's context, or more near peer coaches in co-ops context. It's important to think about, when are we trying to engineer networks versus honoring networks that students may already have, but that are undercapitalized? So this is data, again, from work that we're doing at the high school level. And what we did in an evaluation is we asked students two related questions. We asked them, who throughout the school year has talked to you about your career prospects, about careers, about career possibilities, right? Think of that exposure chart that we were just looking at from Basta. And alternatively, we wanted to understand, when are students proactively mobilizing their network? So who have you asked advice from in the past few months, right? Not just who do you know, but who have you actually tapped to say, I have a question about a career, or I'm thinking about this career, or I need advice. So what does this chart tell us in no uncertain terms? I see two very clear things in this chart. We could talk about it all day, but I'm just going to highlight two phenomena. One is that career exploration and exposure and advice is family engagement. And I think we have separated those constructs, rightfully so, in education, because they are often two totally different mechanisms within our education systems, because the degree to which colleges can engage, if you're a residential college, the degree to which you can engage your parent or family population may be limited by time, geography, resources. But what we know is that students are turning to their families and are hearing from their families far more than other people in their lives about careers. And again, this chart might look different if you surveyed students at your institution. That might be an interesting thing to do, to understand who they're turning to more organically and who's coming to them more organically. But the other thing this chart shows that I think is such a missed opportunity is a long list of undercapitalized relationships. Because we know that students in this sample have relationships with neighbors, with supervisors, with people in their after school community. Again, this is the high school level, with their faith community, with friends of friends. Those are not non-existent relationships in their lives. What they are is they are relationships that they are not actually talking to careers about, even though we know that myriad people in these roles have valuable career advice to lend, might know people who have careers aligned to students' interests, might be able to offer internships or job shadows or the like. So all of that is to say that your students already know people, but may not be talking to them about careers. And sometimes I think we can over-index on talking about networking and building social capital as meeting new people, rather than having new types of conversations with people you already know. So that's a last provocation. I share this because I don't have a great example of an institution or a nonprofit that's really tackling this head on, that's really saying, how might our young people, our students, our recent graduates start to tap into the networks they already have to expand their opportunities. The one example I can point to is an organization called Social Capital Builders, based out here near DC, run by a guy named Ed DeJesus. And he's built an entire curriculum around this idea that we need to coach individuals. He coaches entrepreneurs and young people, sort of people of all stripes, to think about who they already know, to think about how those people could connect them to additional people who could open doors to the sorts of opportunities they want. So that's a final sort of note to end on, in terms of an opportunity set that I think may not feel like it's part of your charge as a career services professional to think about your students' neighbors, right? It may feel really far afield, But when we look at the world through this lens of social capital, there's a lot of latent resources that might be tapped there. So I'm going to wrap up there and share my contact information if anyone wants to follow up. And I'll pause here. We have 15 minutes remaining. We're happy to answer any questions you guys have. I don't know if you can come off mute or you can put questions in the chat, and otherwise we will wrap up this portion of the programming. And Ryan, I can share my slides with you if anyone wants access to the slides.
Okay, that sounds excellent. Yeah, and I think the slides will be available on our website as well.
Oh, perfect. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, so we can open up for questions, and as Julia mentioned, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we'll give it.
Yeah, we'll just wait a few minutes, and Ryan, if you have any questions that you want to kick us off with, feel free.
I do have a couple, but let's see what's out there. And as Julia did mention, as we're waiting for questions, Hawaii P20 is partnered with CCI, and they've been an excellent thought partner and leader, quite frankly, in helping us design some social capital strategies and metrics for some of the nonprofit intermediaries that we're working with at the K-12 in the K-12 space. But definitely looking towards the future, this is a space that we are definitely interested in moving in. Okay. That must have been a very thorough presentation.
All good.
Okay. Okay. Well, I guess we will. We can pause there, Julia, and give them some time.
Yeah,
back. What do you think?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah, great. Again, I'll put my email in the chat in case anyone has follow-up questions. And thank you so much for making time for this conversation today.
Okay, thank you, Julia. As a quick reminder to you all, there is a survey that we'd ask, and we would appreciate your time in filling out. It's very brief. Let me put it into the session here. And if you could go ahead and scan that with your phones, and I will also put the link in the chat here if that's also easier. But we'd love your feedback, any suggestions that you might have. And if not, we will end our session there. And again, thanks to Julia and you all for being here today.